Great. Hello, everybody. Those were two great talks, so I'm really excited that I got to sit through those, and they, in some ways, relate to the talk that I'm going to give as well. So I guess with that, let me share my screen real quick. All right. Hopefully everybody can see that. Does that work for everybody? And actually, pardon me, just if you'll hang on for 1 second while I reorganize something. Okay, great. Yeah, so my name is Felix Ratcliff, and thank you for the really great introduction, Bree. I don't feel I need to introduce myself now. As Bree said, I have a pretty long experience working with camera traps on rangelands, both when I was in graduate school doing this 6-year study down at Tejon Ranch. We used camera traps extensively down there, looking at wildlife and also looking at cattle, and I'm going to talk about some of that work during this talk. And prior to that, I worked on another long-term sort of monitoring project that was actually looking under roads at culverts in an area where they were trying to detect frogs and salamanders that were dispersing under this road. And let me tell you, finding a salamander on a dark night going under a culvert on a camera trap, a blurry camera trap photo is very difficult. And I've, as a consequence, I've looked at, hundreds, well, tens of thousands of these photos and hundreds of hours. So, okay, let me go forward here. Great, so I'm gonna start my talk by going over what is a camera trap, and then I'll go into what I think some of the really great rangeland uses are, and then wrap up with some considerations for, if you're thinking about getting a camera trap, some things you might take into consideration. So a camera trap is basically a camera that can be programmed to take photographs or videos remotely, such that you can put it out, somewhere in the field somewhere and not have to really maintain it very often, and get videos of things that pass by. And typically these cameras take photos for a couple different reasons, right? The first one is, and most commonly, they're activated by an infrared sensor. So basically it's a motion sensor. When something goes in front of it, it triggers a sensor, and then click, it takes a picture of whatever went in front of it. The other way that most camera traps can be set up to take photographs is on like a time interval, right? So you could set up a camera trap to take like a photograph once a day, or once an hour, or once a week. It kind of depends on the model that you're using, how customizable that is. But that's the sort of alternate way that you can use them. Those are basically the sort of like basic parameters you can see, from this image here. They're all going to have like a flash, a camera, a motion sensor, and some kind of weatherproof housing of some sort. Now, beyond that, there are some ways that these, different models will differ, and we'll talk about a little bit of this later too. But just to go into some of the basic differences, one is that many camera traps now will take videos, not just photos, and I would say it's actually more common to find a camera trap that will do both of them than to find one that just does one or the other. Another difference that you might find out there is that there's differences in the kinds of flash units that they have. So one's called a low glow flash, and that's what you're looking at here. It's basically a bank of infrared LEDs that when the flash goes off, if you're an animal looking at those LEDs, what you see is a sort of dull red glow. And the reason that that's good is because, in theory, it doesn't scare wildlife as much as like, a conventional flash from a camera, right? There's also actually something called no glow, which is basically, the same kind of technology, but in this case, it doesn't even emit the red glow. So that's, virtually invisible at night when it takes a photograph. The only downside to taking photos using either low glow or no glow technology is that you'll get a black and white image at night, and you all may be sort of familiar with images taken from camera traps where everything's sort of grayscale taken at night, and those are taken with these infrared flashes. If you want to get like a true color image at night, you have to use something that's more like an incandescent flash. And the downside to that is that, again, if your interest is wildlife, you may, inadvertently sort of scare the wildlife away from that area in the future. So, that's one consideration there. Another is battery life. So just if you are looking at buying one of these units, a lot of times they come, able to accept, say, 8 AA batteries. That's great. And by the way, here's my pro tip, which is that if you buy batteries for camera traps, I always buy lithium batteries. They last, for some reason that I don't understand, they last like 20 times longer than anything else. And I've made the mistake of putting alkaline batteries in here, and it just doesn't really seem to work out. But the amount of batteries that you can get into one of these things varies by model. So that's something you'd want to look into, because if you want to deploy it for a really long time, you'd want to make sure it can accept a bunch of batteries. Generally, these units download to an SD card, which is like the kind of memory card that you would put into your digital camera that that you might own. But some of them actually can be configured to transmit the photos digitally over cell networks or Wi-Fi networks. We're going to talk a little bit about that later as well. And then one last way that some of these models differ from one another is how long, what we call the trigger time, how long the trigger time is. And what the trigger time is basically the time elapsed between when the motion sensor is activated, like when something walks in front of it, and when it actually takes that photograph, right? And so the faster trigger time, the better, really, because you're going to get a a more instantaneous photo and nothing's going to escape. But truthfully, even kind of what I might call like an entry-level camera trap these days, it's going to have a trigger time that's probably less than 1 second. So if your interest is especially large mammals or really any kind of medium to large size mammal, the difference between a half-second trigger time and a third of a second trigger time probably doesn't matter that much for your purposes. So I wouldn't worry so much about trigger time these days. Although if you found a model that say had a 4-second trigger time, you should know that very likely your animal might have moved out of the field of view by the time it actually takes that picture. So so these are all different parameters. There's a lot of different companies that make camera traps these days, and they range from anywhere from about, say, like entry-level models going from maybe a little bit more than $100 per unit, all the way up to say $500 or more dollars per unit. Now, for about $100, I was just sort of updating my info a little the other day, looking around for what I could get for a little more than $100, maybe $120. I saw actually a Bushnell, which is what's pictured here. Although I'm not particularly plugging that brand, but I think that that's a very commonly used entry-level sort of, and they make more expensive ones as well. But certainly you can get some Bushnells for the low 100s, and you can get a unit that'll have less than a half-second trigger time. We'll do both photo and video, have long-lasting batteries, and we'll have one of these low glow flashes, all for a little more than $100. Now, if you spend a lot more, up to say $500 or so, you're going to get something that probably has all of these same abilities. And for your extra money, typically what you're getting is probably a slightly more reliable unit. And having worked a lot with digital camera traps, I can tell you it's a real bummer when they stop working in the field because they overheated, or I've never worked in really extremely cold areas, but that can be a problem for camera traps. And so if you plan to work in cold areas or just anywhere with extremely variable weather, you might consider getting, a more reliable camera, like something like a Reconyx, where you're spending more, maybe about $500, but it's going to function better in these extreme conditions. And that's especially important if you're doing, say, like research or something like that. I mean, if this is more for fun or for some other reason, if you lose a little bit of information, it's not perhaps critical. All right, so let's go into some of these rangeland camera trap uses, and we'll start with something that I've done a lot of with camera traps, which is research. So often when we're doing research on managed rangelands, we want to know some version of the question of what are cows doing out there, or what are livestock doing out there more generally? How many of them are there? Where are they spending their time? And and then oftentimes there's a follow-up question that says, well, given what cattle are doing out there, or given what livestock are doing out there, what is their effect on X resource, right? Say water quality or plant composition or some other factor. A classic way of approaching this this question is to set up, like, say, a livestock exclosure. This is actually a top-down picture on the right here of a livestock exclosure I had at Tejon Ranch when I was doing that 6-year study. I'll outline it there in orange so you can see it a little bit better. And this is a tried and true experimental method for keeping cattle out of a certain area to document what happens when they're removed, say. And while this is a really great approach, it's it can be difficult to replicate this enough to get beyond the simple sort of question of presence absence, right? So if you want to know something maybe a little bit more about like when cattle are in there, what, how seasonal effects of cattle grazing might affect a resource, it can be difficult in say one of these exclosure studies unless you have the resources to do pretty extensive replication. So camera traps can be used in these experimental settings. For instance, one of the ways that you can use camera traps is to tell you, like, well, when did your livestock actually break into your exclosure and start eating all your plants that you tried to, keep out of their reach, right? That's a common problem in these situations. I found this photo of a cow jumping a fence on the internet, and it made me think of I just seen Carolyn Whitesell's talk. I love that picture of the dogs jumping over the fence. So now we have like a little bit of a theme of animals jumping barbed wire fences here. But okay, beyond telling you, say, when cattle broke into your exclosures, they can also provide a bunch of other observational data that can be really useful for, I think, getting at some of the management implications of livestock research or rangeland research. Things like the relative number of livestock in one area versus another area, not just say a stocking rate for a whole pasture, the seasonality of use and time of day of use. And even if you're using that video feature that a lot of cameras have, you can start to get at livestock behaviors, right? Well, are they always just walking through this plot, or do they actually spend time, and do they actually eat forage here? Are they resting here? There's a lot of contextual information you can get from looking at videos. So this is a little bit of that sort of contextual information in graph and table form from the Tejon Ranch study. My main goals were to look at basically the seasonality of use of cattle and also feral pigs. There was a big feral pig population on Tejon Ranch, and see how that affected riparian vegetation. My study was in riparian areas. And so, my main questions were trying to get at differentiating between these two large animals, and also to try to get at the seasonal question of, well, does it matter if the cattle are in there in the fall versus the spring versus the winter versus the summer? And, if so, what were those various effects, right? And so what the camera traps let me do was, first of all, if you look at this pie graph, they let me see the sort of relative use of all the large vertebrate animals down there. So cattle being about accounting for about half of the activity on our plots, pigs for a little bit more than a quarter of the activity on our plots, and then the rest, all those rainbow of colors there, was 12 other species of mammals essentially that frequented our plots. So you can really see, I mean, it gave me this sort of overall context of being able to see that, oh wow, really, when I think about what large animals are spending time on these plots, yes, it's largely cattle and pigs, and you can even see the relative proportions. But then looking within cattle and pigs, if you look at the table on the top there, you can see that I was able to break down their activity based on season, right? So I could say, oh, actually cattle were doing the most of their activity was in the summer, sort of followed by the fall. Those 2 months seem to have the most activity in them. Whereas pigs, it was the fall when they were the most active, right? And then I could relate that back to my results in ways that would be really useful for my interpretation. And then finally, I was able to pull a lot of these behaviors from videos that again helped with the interpretation of, well, why do we think we're seeing this particular management effect? So this is just, I'll show a quick video here to show, one of the ways in which it was just useful for me as a researcher to be able to sort of get some context in what's actually happening on these plots when I'm not there. Because trust me, these pigs were not walking around on these plots when I was there, right? But, but this video and several others like it really opened my eyes to the fact that when these sounder groups, these groups of feral pigs come through, man, they can come in big groups. This wasn't, even nearly our biggest group. We had one video with more than 35 individuals caught, in one video running through the plot. So that was just useful sort of ecological information for my interpretation, I guess. Or a video like this, just documenting, again, a behavior that I had not seen on my own, with cattle trying to battle, with who could be on what side of the bank. This video, just watching it, the other day, putting this presentation together, I had been reading Robin Hood to my kids, and I realized that this is just like the famous fight between Robin Hood and Little John, trying to decide who gets to cross the river. I think, unfortunately, our video ends before we ever figure out who wins this particular fight. So this is not a talk about the research results from Tejo, and I really want to focus more on the camera traps. But just because I have been talking about it, I will say that what our research found down there, just a very brief overview, some key findings, was that basically cattle and pigs in our study had really similar effects overall on this riparian vegetation, causing basically decreases in overall plant cover, total plant cover of upland plants and exotic plants, grasses and forbs. The key way that they really differed is that pigs didn't seem to really affect grasses in the same way that cattle did in terms of the total amount of cover. But sort of significantly, we found no effects on total native plant cover and total wetland plant cover. And if this was a talk about the research, I'd go into a lot more detail on why I think that is. But my point here, because it's about camera traps, is the key thing that we were able to extract with camera traps that we wouldn't have found out if we were just using, say, an exclosure approach, was that it was the late season grazing with cattle, so the summer and the fall, that really seemed to be most strongly related to all these effects, the reduction of these various plant cover types. And with pigs, it wasn't the summer so much, it was just the fall. And additionally with pigs, what we found was that in that fall season, we had way more rooting behavior where they're actually like using their tusks to actively turn the soil. And that's likely because the uplands around there are just too dry to go rooting around looking for bulbs and things in that season. Whereas the riparian areas actually, with these largely sandy soils and still fairly wet in some areas, gave a really nice place for them to go through and turn the soil and look for, various grubs and roots and such. So in any case, those were some of the behavioral and seasonal insights that the camera traps helped us get from our work. Excuse me while I go to the next. All right. So another use of camera traps in rangeland management rangeland management is for monitoring. And there's different things you could monitor for using a camera trap. One of them certainly, and perhaps the most obvious, is wildlife, right? That's kind of what they're designed to do. So some reasons that you might, be interested in monitoring wildlife would be, number one, for research, as we just, went over, but there's a lot of other research applications you could have. Another might be, monitoring wildlife for some conservation purpose, because you're interested in knowing, well, are we getting more deer, over time, or is it, is our population decreasing, or is there any way of telling, to do like statistical sort of rigorous statistical approaches to some of these questions, you have to use set methodologies, but there's a lot you can glean just from, incidentally going out and trapping and getting some sense of what's going on your property. Another is if you are managing a property for hunting, knowing where different animals occur, knowing when they occur. A lot of game species can be quite transient, so it's useful to know, well, are they around right now, or are they not around right now? What seasons do they occur on your property? Are they nocturnal, or are they mostly active during the daytime? Those are all things that somebody who's operating a hunting operation might be interested to know. Another would be, and this keys in perfectly to what Dan Macon was just saying, is it's some awareness about your predators, right? So if you have livestock, knowing what your predators are, when they're around, where they're frequenting, these are the kinds of questions you can answer, again, with a camera trap. And then finally, just for general wildlife awareness, because I think for a lot of us, we're really curious about what animals are around us on our properties. And I think there's a natural curiosity for many about the species that we're surrounded by. So sort of on that last topic of general wildlife awareness, this is a list from our first season of camera trapping down at Tejon Ranch. And you can see there's a ton of things. I don't know, this is probably about 20 different species or so that we recorded. And, a lot of them are large mammal species, cow, coyote, deer, ground squirrels, not that large, I guess. But also we got some birds, golden eagles, mourning doves, and then some, random things like insects. And then there's always a category when you start doing a lot of camera trapping of unknown, because you'll invariably start to get, these pictures of some little hazy, fuzzy, blob in the distance, or a little bit of eye shine and everything's dark. And, what do you do with that? You generally have to just let it go. All right. So some other rangeland monitoring uses that go beyond just thinking about wildlife would be for looking at the vegetation and habitat condition on your rangeland, right? So one would be, for instance, looking at trends during a drought, right? If you photographs, I mean, it's been said before, but certainly, you know, a picture speaks 1,000 words or some such number of words. And having time-lapse photos over time during an event like a drought could tell you something about, you know, how has your vegetation changed? How are things changing year to year or progressing throughout the season? Using camera traps to get close-up or oblique views of grassland growth and height, with in particular with like some sort of reference pole or other object in there, can tell you a lot about the, you know, how your system is functioning, when your production is happening, and things like that. You could potentially use camera traps to monitor erosion sites to see if they are indeed being visited or impacted, perhaps by livestock, perhaps by other things. Perhaps you could, you know, even capture hydrologic phenomenon. I don't have it in this presentation, but I've seen an amazing video actually taken also at Tejon Ranch of a flash flood coming through one of the creeks there, and it is just, it's awesome. I mean, it's amazing, but it's basically a mud flow that comes up about 4 or 5 feet off the, you know, off the surface of the creek. And, you know, that kind of thing is pretty amazing to capture on camera. Similarly, you could monitor infrastructure or, you know, livestock traffic areas. And I think one potentially really useful application would be to think about pond and swale inundation, in particular if you, you know, need to know for your own stock what the inundation period is for your, for a pond, or if you have it for some conservation purpose. So an example of a video that's a non-livestock non-wildlife application of this was a series of photos actually taken by Royce Larson, who's a cooperative extension advisor in, in San Luis Obispo County, and then stitched together by A&R here into a video. And you can see the annual production cycle over the course of the entire growing season, which tells you information. I'm going to see if I can somehow mute it, though. No, I can't. Maybe I'll wait for 1 second.
Felix, you can keep going. We can't hear the sound.
Oh, you can't hear the audio. Okay, great. There's music playing over this that you can't hear. So thanks for telling me that. So this, you know, this tells you a lot about when break of season occurred, you know, when germination occurred, when green up happened, and then when your actual forage production occurred, which I think is just an amazing, instructive video. But looking at that between, you know, year to year could tell you a lot about the function of your rangeland and forage production on your rangelands in different years. All right, so finally, I want to talk a little bit about security applications of this. One potential application is to use camera traps as if they were sort of, you know, security cameras. And so one way you could do that, the East Bay Regional Parks, I'm in the Bay Area here, and the East Bay Regional Park District actually mounts camera traps in several of their parking lots where they have a lot of break-in problems. And, you know, if you're you know, managing a rangeland area that has, say, remote parking lots or something like that, and you do have break-in problems, it could potentially be one solution to you know, deterring theft. Another one is you can use one of these. I mentioned earlier that some of these cameras can actually transmit information over cellular networks or over Wi-Fi networks. And so you could potentially set up a camera trap that's basically would alert you immediately on your cell phone if somebody, say, you know, goes through a gate or, you know, goes past some point that you were monitoring on, say, private property, of course. So I actually worked with somebody who was managing some property that was remote, and they were having terrible problems with, you know, vandalism and dumping of trash and things like that. And so they set up one of these cameras, and every time somebody would go by, she would get a text alert, you know, on her phone. And it was really useful for them to be able to sort of address some of these problems they were having. Until, I will say, the rancher that was running cattle on that property brought his cattle down into that pasture for calving. And then apparently every night after that, there was a whole parade of cattle that went in front of this thing at 1 o'clock in the morning and woke her up with a bunch of text messages, and then went the other way at 2 o'clock in the morning and woke her up with a bunch of text messages going that way. So this is a great technology potentially, though, for people who are in a situation, like this. And the big thing is, the big question is, do you have cellular access, right? Or Wi-Fi access? And so that's a question you'd have to ask yourself before you got one of these. This is actually a picture taken off of one of these security cameras. And notice, please, the timestamp up here saying it's about 2 o'clock in the morning when this parade of cattle came by. So apparently that's one of those shots. And then also, you could see a vehicle entering. I happen to blank out the license plate of this photo, but certainly you'd be able to get license plate information and things like that if you had concerns about that. And then finally, you could even use one of the cameras that, that I was using, say without cellular capacities, to monitor for security purposes. When I was doing that study down at Tejon, I kept losing these orange rebar caps and I could never figure out where they were going. And then finally, I got this video and figured it out. It was coyotes stealing my rebar caps. So that was a pretty great moment when I saw that. All right, and then finally, I just want to say, another reason to get into, using camera traps is just to have fun. It's so much fun to go out and see what kind of things, are on the properties that you're managing or working on or, living on or whatever. This is a video from down in Tejon of a whole family of bobcats just playing right on one of my sites. I mean, never the kind of thing I would get to see if I had, actually been there, of course. This shows you again, by the way, that black and white night footage of the infrared that the infrared cameras take. Here's a mountain lion taken. I was on that plot about an hour before that was taken. And then here's 2 coyotes actually taking a piglet out of a riparian area. That was a pretty jarring video when I saw it the first time, and so I hope you all were okay watching that. But it's amazing actually to get to see a predation event like that again I would never see with my own eyes. And you never know what you're going to see. Like, for example, you might get a shot of Bernie Sanders sitting out with a bunch of wildlife out just in the woods wearing those amazing mittens from the inauguration. Who knows? You never know. I clearly didn't take that photo. All right, so finally, I just wanted to say a couple considerations if you are taking these, if you are thinking about getting a camera trap, and I'm going to keep this quick because I think I'm coming up on the end here. But number one, theft is a real problem with camera traps, in particular if you're working on public lands or lands that otherwise are, say, near a road or near public access. So this, even if you think you're securing it with a cable or a chain or something like that, it's just so easy for somebody who has nobody watching them to cut a chain and make off with it. And I've got lots of stories about that myself. Another one is it takes a huge amount of time to review photos or videos. Videos take a lot of time. Imagine 30-second videos and you've got 10,000 or something like that. So keep that in mind if you're actually going to deploy, say, like 5, 10, 15 cameras or something like that, right? And then finally, one other point is that, the public may not want to be photographed, may not like the idea of being monitored on, say, parkland or other public lands. And so clearly, if you work at an agency or some other area, say, park district or something like that, you would want to review your own, protocols for whether that was okay or not, because otherwise you might get a lot of letters from the public about it. Yeah. Great, and so thank you. And with that, I'll just leave you with a video of a golden eagle that we had on one of our plots, just flew in to visit. So please let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Felix. That was great, very comprehensive. So we do have several questions in the chat. We have just 1 minute left. So I guess one of the quick questions was, is there any way to deal with sensitivity and wind or grass blowing in front of them? And then I'll let you handle the others after.
Great. Yeah, I'll do the other ones on the chat. So that's such a great question. So camera sensitivity, it depends on the camera. Some cameras have variable sensitivity with their sensors. What that means is that some of them you can set them to be less sensitive so that every tiny little movement of the grass doesn't set them off. It has to be, a larger movement in front of them. But the main tip is when you set it up, make sure there's no vegetation, especially tall grass or tree branches or something like that. In, even say in the first 20 feet or so, depending on, again, on your sensor, and that'll depend on your model. Because when the wind blows vegetation for hours on end, that's when that's when you end up with, say, 10,000 photos and only one of them has a picture in it, and you're sitting there just clicking, next. It's mind numbing. So so the main thing is try to set them up where they won't get those multiple triggers from blowing vegetation, but you can look into it, and some models will allow you to get a model with a variable sensitivity in the sensor.
Great, thanks, Felix.
Thank you.